Hello and welcome back to Hydroponics Daily. Today is the first episode about lighting, and I'm going to do a few episodes about lighting, all the different types of lighting, including the sun. And today we're going to start off with incandescent light bulbs and fluorescent bulbs, because I'm lumping them together because they really can't do a full episode on incandescent light bulbs because there's just not enough to talk about. So incandescent light bulbs are the traditional light bulbs you remember with the filament, and they have slowly been replaced by LED lights and fluorescent lights in the home, so in lamps and things like that. But they are still used in horticulture, and a lot of nurseries that grow photoperiodic plants actually stockpiled incandescent light bulbs when they were banned in Europe and in the UK because they were so useful. Now, they're not using them as grow lights. They aren't using them to drive photosynthesis. These are on nurseries where you want to manipulate the photoperiod, so extend the period of light that the plants actually perceived light for. Now, many hydroponic growers, indoor growers, will just think, well, I just put my lights on for 12 hours or 18 hours or 20 hours, and that's how I extend the photoperiod. But if you're growing something like a poinsettia or a chrysanthemum, and you're actually using sunlight in a greenhouse for photosynthesis, and it would be too expensive because of the crops and the economics to actually extend the actual photoperiodic time to 20 hours. You don't actually want the plant to be photosynthesizing for 20 hours. It's not economical. You just want the plant to perceive the light. And plants can perceive day length at much lower light levels than they can actually photosynthesize at. So there have been problems before where like street lamps that have been put up next to greenhouses, and they've screwed up the photoperiod of the plants growing in the greenhouse, that plants can detect such low light levels as a photoperiod. And so what growers do is actually, rather than putting loads of grow lights in their nursery, they actually just put one or two incandescent light bulbs in, and obviously using a very, very small amount of light, and they actually massively increase the photoperiod that plants are perceiving. So the sun might go down at 4 o'clock in the winter, but you could just have a few incandescent light bulbs on and the plants will perceive it till 11 o'clock at night. Incandescent light bulbs are really good for this. They're not the most energy efficient, but because of the spectrum they produce, plants perceive it really well. So they produce a lot of red light at 660 nanometers, and that is where plants detect day length. The pigment that they use is phytochrome. It's not chlorophyll. Chlorophyll for photosynthesis, phytochrome for day length and other sort of like light quality issues. So incandescent light bulbs are used for that. I'm not aware of anyone who's used incandescent light bulbs to drive photosynthesis as grow lights. Maybe back in the day in the 50s and 60s they did, but that's certainly not the case. Fluorescent lights, so the tubes and the bulbs, so the tubes have been used routinely in grow rooms in the past. So when I was a PhD student and a postdoc, so in the early 2000s, fluorescent light bulbs in grow cabinets and grow rooms at universities were the standard. And so we would have phytotrons, these big cabinets you'd go in, and all the air conditioning, the units, you can precisely control light levels and photoperiod, but they would still be using fluorescent tubes because that was what we had. We didn't have LED lights at that period. Sodium lamps would have been producing too much heat, and the spectrum would have been not quite right. So fluorescent lights were really good for that. And they were really good in micropropagation labs as well, and still are used in micropropagation labs because you can produce a lot of light very efficiently. And it gets the plants photosynthesizing a bit. It's not the optimum for photosynthesis, but they're very cool. So they're really good in grow rooms where you want micropropagation or to study plants. They're also still used fairly routinely in propagation. So if you have a propagation tank, you can get an array, so a linked up series of T8s, I think it is, or T5s, the fluorescent tubes, and they work really well still. You need to direct the light back down to the plants because it's being produced 360 degrees. So they'll often have a reflector at the top. And that's one of the issues, is that when you get into actually really want to supercharge photosynthesis, fluorescents start to be not the best option. So you wouldn't put fluorescents in a greenhouse or a grow room, because they're shooting off light in 360 degrees anyway. And there's a lot of coverage required to get a decent light intensity. So if you're in a greenhouse, you would, during the day, you'd be stopping all that sunlight from getting to the plants, because the whole canopy would just be covered in fluorescent lamps. And the same in a grow room, your entire roof would be fluorescent lamps, and you still wouldn't be producing as much light as you could with sodium lights or with LEDs. So that's why you don't see fluorescent lights used for growing. It's only for propagation and in old style grow rooms. So fluorescent lights, they're cheap and cheerful. So you might think, well, why don't you just use LEDs in your micropropagation unit or in your grow tent, your for your cuttings, your propagation tent? And you can, and there are a lot of replacement bulbs now where you can get LEDs that are like for like replacements with the fluorescent tubes. They won't fit the same electrical connectors because you need a special ballast for a fluorescent, a little, I don't know what the word is, an inverter, is it? I'm not an electrical expert, but basically they won't you can't retro install LED lights into fluorescent tubes. You have to rework it. So you're better off just buying a whole new, I don't know what the word is, holder for your LED lights and fixing them to your propagation tent. LED lights will be a lot better for propagation because they'll be very efficient, but you actually can fine tune the spectrum for what you need. And for propagation, you probably want a bit of far red light in there. Not many times you'll hear me saying that far red light is good for growing crops, but if you want to stimulate rooting, a bit of far red would be good. And the other good use for fluorescents, I forgot about this one, is that fluorescents are a really good way of producing a black light, a UV light. And I still use this I've got a UVB light that is designed for people who keep reptiles. So for reptiles, for some reason, need UV light, and so you can get a UVB light, and that is a fluorescent light, a compact one, so one that goes in a normal bulb socket, like an incandescent bulb socket, and that produces a good level of UV light. They're made of they have a special phosphor, which is the chemical that emits light in fluorescent lights, and mercury phosphor, and then they have a special glass that goes around it, because normally glass prevents the emission of UV light. It stops UV. That's why you don't get sunburns in a greenhouse, but you can in a polytunnel. That's why you don't get sunburns in your house, because the UV light's not coming through. So you need a special type of glass, and I'm trying to find what it's called. What's it called? Here we go. Let's have a look. Yeah, it's Wood's glass, which sounds like it's made of wood, but it's not. It's an optical glass invented in 1903. That is a long time ago, considering lighting technology. And it allows ultraviolet and infrared light to pass through while blocking most visible lights. So a black light can have a peak, one single peak at 380 nanometers, whereas normally a fluorescent light has a number of different peaks, and it's particularly high in green light, and that's why it's good for human perception, because humans have evolved to perceive green light really well. And so that's why when you see a really industrial fluorescent light, it looks really bright and almost oppressive, not kind to the eyes. And people like sunlight, and that's why bulb manufacturers are always trying to get sunlight, close to sunlight. There's a guy in my village, and his house is illuminated with industrial fluorescent light bulbs. And I was thinking, I would hate to live there, because his house must be horrible to live with. So big, strong emission in green, and then peaks at certain other. So it doesn't reflect sunlight very well. And so that's why another reason why fluorescence is not used very often. Green light can be used by plants, things like carotenoids, anthocyanins. They can use it for photosynthesis. However, it's not the best form of light. It's not energy efficient for the photons to be absorbed into photosynthesis. That's why plants are green, because they're emitting green light. They're just, not the ones that are in the canopy. The primary plants are just not using green, and so they emit it out. That's why, and so they transmit it or reflect it. They're absorbing the red and blue. That's why they look green. Now, under canopy plants will use green because that's all that's left. If you think about in the rainforest, the canopy trees, the orchids, the bromeliads way up there, they've absorbed all the red and the blues and the oranges, and they're just, the plants on the bottom floor will be able to, that's all they've got is the green light. And so things like Calanthea, which is from the Amazon rainforest, they often have really purple leaves because they are reflecting purple when they're brought out of the understory, and so they're able to use the green. So you might have a shade-loving plant, but for most plants, you don't want fluorescent bulbs that are high in green. So that's why we don't see fluorescent bulbs on sale very often. And the other thing that you have to consider with fluorescent bulbs is they contain a significant amount of mercury. And so if your bulb smashes above your plants and you don't pick up all the bits, then you could potentially get mercury contamination of your grow media and your plants. So that's not good, especially that dust. When that dust flies, when a fluorescent bulb smashes, that dust is going over your crops. You don't want to be inhaling or smoking or eating mercury dust. Other thing to consider with fluorescent bulbs is that they do emit a small amount of UV light. So if you sat under a UV light, which I'm doing at the moment, a fluorescent light, I'm sat under a fluorescent bulb here, and if I'm sat here for 8 hours in this office, I will get the same amount of ultraviolet light absorption into my skin as if I was sat outside for 1 minute, which is not very much. But if you're albino, that might be an issue. And if your plants were sensitive to UV light, then that might be an issue. Most plants, a small amount of UV light is actually beneficial. There are a number of companies actually selling UV emitting LEDs now to prime plants for beneficial effects like improved stress tolerance, abiotic stress, so environmental stress, and resistance to disease, transplant shock, and also all sorts of crazy things. So fluorescent lights could be a bit beneficial because they emit a small amount of UV. If I was growing a crop and I wanted to stimulate pigment production, I would stick one of my little UV fluorescent plants in my grow room and put it on for a few minutes every day just to stimulate stress responses, beneficial stress responses, and pigmentation. So because if you put UV in the plants, they'll often pigment up. You'll get reds and often purple tinges to your plants. So that's a good tip. You don't need to use fancy LED UV lights for that, but you can do. And the advantage of them is that if they're integrated into the LED arrays, then you get much more uniformity in your response. Whereas if you had just one UV light, one bulb in the center, you might get loads of pigmentation in the center and not at the edges. So, uniformity is very important for crops when you're growing them and trying to sell them, import especially. So that's been fluorescent bulbs for today. I think I've covered pretty much everything. I think I'm not going to go into the technical details of how a fluorescent bulb works because A, it's not important for hydroponics, and B, I don't know. And I'm just going to be reading off websites if I did that. And that would be dull as dishwater. I suppose it's important to note that fluorescent bulbs are they have a much longer lifespan than incandescent bulbs. So they'll last longer, need replacing less often, but they will burn out, and the ballast will burn out as well. So they'll need replacing as well. Whereas LEDs and I think even sodiums will last longer than a fluorescent. So that's been Hydroponics Daily for today. Incandescent bulbs, their use in photoperiod. Oh, before I go, I have thought of another use for fluorescent bulbs and incandescent bulbs. When you go into a greenhouse, they're the bulbs that you turn on just so you can walk around and view your plants. Now, so often you'll get a fluorescent light along the gullies where the aluminium gullies are in a greenhouse, and obviously, because fluorescence and incandescence are really attuned to the human eye, they're really good for just illuminating the crops so you can walk in and do things when the grow lights aren't there, or it's at night or early in the morning or late at night. So, don't think you don't have to install fluorescent lights if you're in a greenhouse or in a grow room, because you might have to, especially if you're using coloured LEDs where it's that purplish, or you've got multiple spectra and they're not white LEDs. You don't perceive them. You could get very ill if you don't have fluorescent or incandescent light bulbs, probably fluorescents. You can get nausea, and obviously you can get eye damage as well, because if you've not got that green light, you can't perceive how intense the light is, and your retinas can get burnt. So fluorescent bulbs are really good in greenhouses just for illuminating the crop, spotting pests and diseases. If you had purple LEDs and you're looking for pests, good luck trying to find a spider mite. If you've got purple LEDs, you need a fluorescent bulb or a white LED to actually find them. So still used routinely for that use. That's been Hydroponics Daily for today. Incandescent bulbs for use for photoperiod control in greenhouses, fluorescent bulbs used for propagation, and also, what was the other use for? UV lights as well, dark lights, there where fluorescents are used. Okay, if you found this interesting, please share it with a friend. If a friend has shared this podcast episode with you, then you officially owe them a beer, because you've obviously learned something amazing because of that. So get round to your mates who's just sent you this podcast and go to the pub for a beer. Thank you very much for listening. Until tomorrow, goodbye.